Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on what's turning out to be a beautiful Thursday, at least where I am. I hope the same is true for you. This is indeed online lunch break webinar for October, where we're talking about budgeting and financial oversight, two of the board's very important jobs. And we generally talk about this time of year because if you haven't started on your budgeting process yet, I'm guessing you'll get there pretty soon. I think most of you know me by now. My name is Susan Holson. I'm the Director of Education Services for VSBA, and I'm joined behind the scenes today by Carrie Lamb, who is making sure we run smoothly. So I want to preface this by saying today's topic, we're really talking about really basic level stuff. So if any of you are CPAs or work with numbers regularly, this may be an unnecessary stop for you, but we do hear regularly from school board members who are not numbers friendly that this can be an overwhelming part of the work because they're not accustomed to looking at financial statements. And so that's how we're going to keep it at that introductory level today. If you have questions at any level, I'm happy to attempt to answer them. So some of you, certainly some board members, are very comfortable with numbers and financial statements. Some of you manage to get your household budgets aligned and file your taxes. And then there are those of you who are pretty mathophobic. And I have had the pleasure of having a business partner in my past life who was mathophobic and really didn't understand financial statements and didn't want to be looking at them, which is a problem. And it's particularly a problem if you're a school board member and your community, your public has entrusted you with responsibility for the budget and accountability for how the money is being spent. So with that said, the board's role is really a very high level oversight. You are accountable to taxpayers. You want to be able to demonstrate that they're getting a good return on their education investment, meaning that they feel that their tax monies that they're sending to pay for your school district's operations are worth it. And so you do that in several different ways and different steps, and we'll talk through some of them today. Your role in budgeting is to make sure that adequate resources are allocated to accomplish the goals that you as a board have set for your district, and also that you're making progress toward the bigger vision in your strategic plan. And then after the budget's approved, your job switches over to monitoring those financials. So you're making sure that the monies are being spent aligned with the budget and that the district is financially healthy, and also that you're required by law to hire an auditor, and the auditor will review, we'll talk more about that, but auditor will review the financial statements prepared by your business office at the end of the year and provide a report talking about what you've done well and where there might be some areas for improvement. And truthfully, all of the audit reports I've ever seen on school districts, the thing that comes back most commonly is that the reserve fund has either gotten too big or that you have spent too much of it. And so you need to pay attention to that as we go along. So first of all is the budget cycle, right? The board actually begins this process. A lot of people think that it starts with the administration, but it really starts with the board because the board sets the goals and thus provides guidelines to the administration about the budget. And those guidelines can take a lot of different forms. It could be that you know your community is really panicked about a tax hike, and so you want to have a level budget, which in some cases will mean cutting things to accommodate the increased costs in other things. More commonly, you might want to have level program in your budget. So you're going to keep everything the same in the school, and it's just going to cost a little bit more this year because the utility bills are expected to go up, and people relate to that because we all deal with that in our private business, also in our households. So then the administration gets that order. Oh, and I might add that the board also has policy behind the budget process, and we'll get into that a little bit, but that also gives direction to administration. And when I talk about administration here, as with everything I look at in governance, the board is working through the superintendent. This is probably the time of year where the superintendent is very happy to delegate to the business officer, and that's the person that the board is going to be dealing with primarily. But the starting point is through the superintendent, who is also simultaneously getting input from the buildings in the district as to what the needs are as the building administrators see them. So the administration encompasses many voices, but the board's contact, of course, is with the superintendent. So then the administration takes your priorities, and it may, so I said, you may say we're going to just level program. You may also say, okay, we think we can sustain a 2% increase in spending. What's that going to mean for our taxes? Because we all know that our current education funding formula, the taxes may not change at the same rate as the budget is changing. And I think it's very, very important for board members to keep that perspective, because the district is looking at the costs, and the costs are going to change year over year. But the board, as the link to your community, you're also really concerned that the community's values are being included in this and their ability to pay for it. So if you're in a town that, because of your CLA, has to pay $1.25 for every dollar in your budget, you're going to have to pay attention to what your increase is going to do to the taxes for your communities. So the administration then works through a budget as directed by the board, and perhaps an alternative that includes some of the priorities that others in the district have. So they may, the principal in one of the elementary schools may say that they, really, really need to be resurfacing the playground. And that was not something that was done last year, so it wasn't included in last year's budget. But that if it's unsafe for children, then it's going to be something that the board is most likely going to authorize. And then you're going to have to figure out, where is that money going to come from? And that's the conversation that goes on between the board and the administration in the process. And that tends to happen a couple of times. So the board reacts to that first draft of a budget and sees some things that look fine and some things that they question. And what about that Chinese language program that we promised our community? We don't see that in here. We need to fit that in. Well, if you're going to do that, again, what is the administration recommending is going to scale back, and what does the board feel is what the community wants to have scaled back? And eventually you come to agreement on a budget that's within the parameters that the board feels is representing what the community is looking for. And then if the responsibility goes back to the board officially adopts the budget. And in many, many districts, there's a public meeting prior to that adoption where you introduce the budget to your voters ahead of the actual voting. And I believe that it's 6 weeks ahead of, in order to warn the budget and the vote. And then the board's job is to educate your voters. You have adopted a budget, but it's not final and official, of course, until the voters approve it. And they want to know your rationale. And you can't, by law, go and say, go out and vote for this budget. You can explain the budget and then say, and make sure you get out to vote, or make sure you're at town meeting day to have your voice heard. But you cannot direct somebody how to vote. And then it's in the voters' hands, and with any luck, they're going to pass that budget, and that'll send you into phase 2 of the cycle, which we'll pick up in a little bit. Okay, so developing that proposed budget, I mentioned there are policies. There's a model policy about budgeting that helps establish the guidelines. Make sure you've got those community values in there. If there are natural resources in your district that are available and important to the community, whether it's economically or recreationally or just as an identity, and that can be incorporated into your budget, then you want to make sure that that's reflected. So it may be more important to your community to have X than to have Y. And as long as it's still good education that's being offered and you're not sacrificing something critical, that's really has to be top of mind. And then you delegate. Then it goes to the administration. So that's rounding that first corner of the cycle we were just looking at. And some of the things to check in on are the reasonableness of cost per student. The budget translates to taxes through the cost per student. That's the first piece that really gets scrutinized. So if you're seeing a major change in the cost per student, that may be cause to rework that. I'm thinking particularly in communities where in the last year you've had a large influx of students, or what we had been seeing over time, that you're losing student count. In either case, that's going to severely affect the cost per student. And if your cost per student is hiking way up because you're keeping level programs, so you're keeping all of your staff and faculty in place, and you're keeping all of your curriculum in place, and you're not going to change a thing, but your student count is down 2%, it's going to be reflected in your cost per student going higher. And since everything else in the tax calculation is based on that cost per student, that is really a good starting place to start looking at the trends and how they're driving that number. That, as I said, combined with information coming from the state in December, you can project tax rates based on the Joint Fiscal Office projection of what they think is going to be in place when the legislators finalize things like the budgetary yield and your actual student count you get in October. So there are different pieces that come in at different times. And that's really all for the administration to be integrating into the drafts that you're seeing, and be available to explain that to you. The broad educational priorities has to be something that the administration and the board both support. Often they start with the board, but they get translated into action by administration. And broad financial guidelines. If you've been running a big surplus year over year, then you get to designate how much of that prior year fund balance you want to transfer in to this year's budget calculations. After the board has adopted, once you have that budget that you agree on with administration, the board makes sure that the district's needs are being met there and that nothing that has been sacrificed is going to really hurt the district. And also make sure that you're being fiscally responsible, by which I mean things like making sure that you're putting aside that reserve fund, which the auditors like to look at. You need to sort of do what my father used to call a smell test, to get your sense of, will the community be able to support this budget? Or are there controversial items in there? Not just the tax rate, but maybe there are controversial items that they have issue with adding or taking away from your programs. Often when we need to cut budgets, the non-essential, meaning the things around which we do not have standards, are the first things that people look at to cut. And music and art are often among them. And if that's just not going to fly with the community, they're not going to allow that to happen, then you're going to have to look a little harder. Where's that money going to come from? And finally, once you've gone through all of that, you adopt that budget. And remember, as you present this to the community, you want to do that in the context of what the vision is for the students in the district, what your priorities are for your students, and where you've been most recently. And then the electorate needs to have enough material to be able to analyze the budget. Again, some of them are CPAs and some of them are number phobic, but they need to have what they need to be able to understand what it is that the board and the district are asking of them, and then they vote on that budget. And if they reject it, of course, you have a limited time to prepare a next draft, really, and approve it and send it on to the voters. So before we make the next bridge into actually looking at budgets and financial statements, are there any questions? Is there anything so far that doesn't feel right?
I'm not seeing any in the question box or in the chat box.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So I'll keep going, but again, questions are always welcome. So your budget is broken into expenses and revenue. If you are accustomed to working in any kind of a business, usually you'll see your revenue first and take your expenses out from that, and that leaves you what's left. But this is completely not like that. We start here with the expenses. How much does it cost to run your school district? And that includes instruction, instructional support, your administration, your co-curriculars, summer school, special education needs, guidance, health offices, student support services, occupational therapy, physical therapy, the school psychologist, all of it, technology, maintenance, the whole shebang, right? And that's all the expenses. And then you're going to look at revenues. Well, what are the revenues that the district has before you even talk about raising money through taxes? Locally, you have your fund balance. So if you are running in a surplus situation from the current year as you're planning for the next year, you can allocate some of your or all of your surplus to alleviate some of the tax burden. And if you have students who are tuitioning in, the tuition that you receive becomes part of your local revenue. If you have money invested, interest earned on that becomes part of the revenue. The state will provide special education support and transportation support. And then there are grants that come also through the state with Medicaid and IDIB and other things of that nature. And when you do the math, then you take the revenue away from the expenses, and the next is the state education grant, which is the amount to be received from the state education fund. I'm not going into a whole explanation today of how the budget translates into the tax rate. If you are not familiar with how that all works, we have a video on our website. It's a few years old now, so some of the numbers are out of date, but the basis for it is exactly the same. And if you take 11.5 minutes to watch that video, which is on our website, you will get a sense of exactly how complicated our funding system is. But the amount that you need to receive from the state is ultimately, when we add that up, when the state adds all of that from all of the past budgets in all of the districts in Vermont, and then they can figure out how to send it back to you. And that involves calculations on tax rates. And I'll leave it at that for now. If anybody wants to dive into that with me, I'm happy to do that. I think that is a whole other discussion. But as I said, happy to take that on. So the expenses, as I said before, includes everything that the district plans to spend in a fiscal year when we're talking about a budget, right? So direct instruction, that's salaries, benefits, supplies, learning materials, all of those things for special education, plus any specialized equipment that might be necessary, your athletics, your co-curricular, your student support services, professional development for faculty and administration, technology, are your licenses all up to date? Are you on a replacement cycle for hardware? How's that working? Are you up to date in your plan for all of that? Administration salaries, benefits, an audit, legal services, and any dues and fees that the district encounters by participating in various things. And finally, facilities. You need to maintain your facilities. That involves personnel, which is salaries and benefits. You've got utility bills. You've got to pay for insurance and phone and equipment and transportation. So there's a whole lot in that expenses line, right? And as I said earlier, and that also includes debt service. So if you've got a bond from 4 years ago that you're still paying on, that's got to be included in your budget as well under expenses. And revenue includes the local items, tuition, interest on investments, the special ed block grants and reimbursements, and prior year balance, etc. So there's a lot of pieces that go into that, and that can be really intimidating. That's sometimes, I think, why people who aren't used to looking at financial statements get so wigged out when they see the budget packet, because it's pages and pages and pages of numbers. So let's break it down a little bit, okay? If you're here's a budget proposal that came to the board from administration, from the business office. This is obviously just one small section of it, right? And there are different ways to look at this and different levels at which to look at this. But let's just start by identifying the columns. So the actual from FY, the previous year, is important as a benchmark, right? They're usually there so that you can compare your current year and projected actuals as the basis for any budget shifts between items, between instruction and facilities, for example. So that this is a FY22 proposed budget. So we have actual for FY20, we have actual for FY21, which isn't over yet, right? So that means that's a projection, what they think the year is going to end up to be compared to what the budget is for the current year. And then the budget that's being proposed for next year. And the dollar change and percent change is budget to budget in this case. Anybody have questions about this? Is this clear to everyone?
See no questions in the Q&A, but it looks like maybe in the chat we have one. For smaller communities that are full choice, the cost per student might not be the key variable, rather number of students enrolled. What can we do to prepare for this variable?
So my understanding is the question pertains to districts that are not operating schools. Still in all, the taxes are based on the cost per student. So you have the tuition rates for the sending schools, and the variable and how many dollars you need to raise will be determined in part by the number of students and in part by the tuition being charged at their schools of choice. But the state actually requires that the budget calculations base off of a cost per student. You may be familiar with the yield that they use, which is a cost per student baseline. It's not really a calculation, and it's certainly not a block grant as it once was way back when. But it's a number they use for calculation purposes to determine how a community is going to pay based on that cost per student compared to the yield, and also taking into account make sure I've got all of these pieces right. So it's the common level of appraisal, whether you are still receiving any kind of tax incentives from prior merger activity. There's a worksheet, and that worksheet actually must be presented to the public with your budget. So Jeff, I'm not sure if I really answered your question.
Okay, we have another question.
Great.
Seeing a significant surplus for the second year, could this be considered irresponsible budgeting to taxpayers?
If it's really huge, I think it is something worth addressing. And as I said earlier on, when your books are audited, if the auditor believes that you're building in too much surplus or you're generating too much surplus, and that's going to your reserve fund, and that reserve fund is growing bigger than it needs to be, you'll be advised to scale that back. And you can do that by transferring more of your surplus into your current year to help offset, which counts as a revenue item and therefore helps offset the amount that you need to raise, I'll say through taxes, even though it's not a direct relationship to our tax rates, as we all know. I'm not sure if I answered that. Carrie, can you read me that question one more time?
Sure. Seeing a significant surplus for the second year, could this be considered irresponsible budgeting to taxpayers?
Okay, thank you. I don't know that I'd call it irresponsible, because it depends what went into those budget calculations in the first place. Maybe your school district had intended to have a certain number of faculty and wasn't able to hire everybody you had thought you were going to have. And so you end up with a extra money in the salaries line or the benefits lines because you have fewer employees. So if the intent was to pay for what you needed, then I don't think it's being misleading to your taxpayers. If you're padding the budget so that you can have these big surpluses, that's a strategy I would encourage you to revisit. because transparency is important. You know, your taxpayers elect you because they trust you, and they trust you to be doing the work that they don't want to be doing, of making sure that your district is fiscally responsible. So if your tax rates are high and you're generating a lot of surplus, then you probably want to have that conversation, certainly as a board and maybe as a community. Okay, we'll move on, but keep the questions coming. Okay, so that's kind of the budget process, and those are the things to look for. Boards get bogged down at budget time and year round at looking at each line item to the detail. And first of all, it's not necessary. You have a business manager, and you may have, depending on the size of your district, a whole department of people who are there crunching all these numbers, and you don't need to. You need to trust your employees, the employees of the district, that that they've been hired for their expertise in this area, and that they're proceeding using generally accepted accounting practices. But if you have that basic trust, you shouldn't need to be scrutinizing each of these items. I personally, I go straight to the change numbers. How much more money are we looking to be spending on salaries? $110,000. That sounds like it's another person or more. And probably when this budget was being presented to me as a board member, my business manager was provided notes to the statement, to the document, saying, and this is what's included in this change, and insurance going up 7% here. Well, that's the state bargaining, and that's really out of our control, and that's the best number we have to work with. I'm looking down the line here. The other things should be pretty well in line. Oops, there's something going up 8%. Let's see, what am I looking at there? That's tuition to private schools. Are we losing students to private schools? What should the board be doing to address that? That's the question at the board level, not who gets $50,000 for tuition. Right? That's not the issue here. The issue is the health of our district, and that includes the financial health. And if indeed we're adding staff, which is what this would suggest, or maybe that's just the contracted salary increases, a 1.43%, but staff in your contract from your last collective bargaining. And so all of the numbers that build off of the salary, so all the benefits that come off of that are going to go up accordingly. So you have a kind of a comfort with that explanation as to why salaries are going up, and any of the other things that look like they're going up more than you would expect, you should ask about. So then we get to the second part of this budget cycle, which is about monitoring the expenditures. We talk sometimes wrongly about monitoring the budget. Well, you're monitoring how the budget's being used, right? And again, this wants to stay at high level stuff. So the administration is providing you with financial statements. And again, that may be in, I hope that there are some parameters around that in your policy manual as well, including how frequently you're seeing them. Personally, I think if you're looking at quarterly statements, you're getting the whole picture and at an appropriate level for the board. A lot of boards look at monthly statements, and that's fine too. As long as you know not to be getting into the weeds with how this bill was allocated to this line item and not that line item. That's not your job. So the board reviews the financials, asks questions, and raises any concerns you might have about how it's going relative to budget, and shares your results openly and with the public. That's really important. When you're talking about money, you need to have trust. People need to know that the board is watching this on their behalf and questioning things that don't look right. The voters therefore understand the challenges, and they'll continue to support the board in future, hopefully, in future budget years, because they know that you're really watching it, and that things are not spiraling out of control, that somebody's got an eye on how our money's being spent in line with our stated goals. And then we're back to the beginning of the last slide on the budget cycle, right? The board's going to represent the community's values into next budget cycle. So if the community has been outraged because salaries have been so underspent because you cannot find enough people, which is certainly something we're seeing in every industry right now, that means you're not being able to provide the education that you had expected to your students. That may require a bigger conversation than, oh, well, we gotta, we can take some money out of there because we can't find the people. Maybe you need to talk about, maybe we need to pay people more. Maybe that's why they're not here. Maybe that's why, certainly in the last year, and I hate to say that I anticipate in the coming year, we saw people leave the profession because the challenges were daunting. And so I don't know if we're going to have a teacher shortage in the future, but I do know that there are parts of the state that have been struggling with this for a long time. And so you need to find other ways to look at how you're going to solve those problems. And that's the board level. That's that high level oversight. So as you're monitoring, the board wants to make sure that the resources are being used as intended. And what I mean there is that you're moving toward your vision and you're accomplishing your goals and moving in the direction of your mission. I don't mean that each line item has to be matching up with the budget. That's not really required. The budget that's approved, while it has all of the details, if you look at the article on the ballot is to approve the total at the bottom. That this is how much we're going to need to raise to run our schools. And it's not, and it's going to be spent in exactly these ways. So the line items are important to be watching, but they're not where you need to be focusing your energy on how you're doing relative to budget. You do want to make sure that the district, I said before, is financially healthy. So making sure that your current budget use is aligned with your planned budget use as stated in your original budget. And then you have, I mentioned before, a legal responsibility to have an independent auditor come and look at your books once a year and provide you with an auditor's report. And if you are not the numbers person or among the numbers people on your board, that report is pretty dense and it may be hard for you to get through, but there's always a section that talks about what modifications the auditor would recommend, if any, and that's worth paying attention to. So what's the board's role here? I'm going to repeat and repeat and repeat a high level perspective. It's to ensure that the resources are used to accomplish the district's mission. And in order to ensure the financial health of the district, the boards have to review financial statements and compare them to the budget and also have that auditor take a look at them who is completely independent. And I cited a couple of additional financial management related policies in the policy manual that you probably have in your own policy manual, or at least some version of them, but it's worth taking another look at those. And reminding yourself of how your budget is intended to start, to progress, and what the board's expectations are around your financial reports and the statements that you're seeing. I mentioned before about the frequency of them, all of that. So what is there to understanding these financial statements, right? Lots of numbers on the page again. One thing is critical, and that is the time period. Are you looking at a monthly statement of expenses and revenue, or is it quarterly, or is it annual? The abbreviation YTD means year to date. So, you know, we're closing in on looking at a quarter, right, coming up, but it's important to know what you're looking at. It's also important to remember that we do not have monthly or quarterly budgets. We only have an annual budget. Sorry, I needed some water. And so how do you compare, you know, a 4-month expenditure with an annual budget? Do you just divide by 4? No, not really. So usually you'll get some guidance on that from your business office, and I'll share that with you in a minute. Your actuals that you're going to see, the actual numbers are what reflects your real spending. And again, that you're going to compare that to your budget and you'll see a variance. That just means it's not what you expected. And the term encumbrance may be splattered across your financials also. In funds that are encumbered refers to things that have future obligations with known amounts. So if debt service is one, for example, you know, you got to pay monthly, whatever on that bond, and the finance office certainly knows the amount of that for the rest of the year. So they can include that already. It's encumbered. That means those funds can't be redistributed. Insurance is another good example of encumbered funds. Anything that can actually be predicted in advance. If you have any contracted work for the duration of the contract period, that would be included there. And I go back to the reporting frequency. I think it's a challenge for boards who get involved in monthly review of the financial statements to stay at that high level of monitoring, because the temptation is to compare one month to another and wonder why salaries this month were higher than last month. And then you get into the whole conversation of, well, you know, we had to hire maternity coverage for Mrs. Jones because she took off unexpectedly and we hadn't planned on that. And so now you see the cost of it. The board just doesn't need to be involved at that level. That's really deep in the weeds for what you need. So I would discourage anybody from diving in that deeply. So what are the key questions you want to be thinking about when you look at your financial statements? The time period, what's being measured, how often are we looking at it? Are we comparing apples to apples if we're looking at an annual budget number? What is the performance compared to the budget? And make sure you understand what all of the variances, the big variances are. Again, your financial statements come with notes, and those notes should address anything that's different or unusual or unexpected. And if there's anything that you're not clear about, that you need some clarification on, that your business office can explain to you, now's the time to ask when you're being presented with your statements. And then what's the format that you're getting? Are you getting the information you need? And is there anything else that you need in order to perform your oversight role? So maybe you don't need to see every line item, and you're okay to see them condensed into things like instruction. And all things related to instruction are encapsulated there. And then if you have a question about that big amount, you can ask the financial office to break it down if there's something going on there that needs further attention, closer inspection. So here's a real live report that I borrowed from a business officer. So what are the things that we need to really study here? Well, first, make sure you understand what the columns mean, okay? So let's go back to that last slide. What's important? Well, the first thing is the time period, right? So there it is. This is expenses for FY21 through March of 2021, okay? So April, May, June is the last quarter. So you're 3 quarters in on this budget, on this statement. That's important to know, right? Next, we want to see how we're performing versus the budget. So we have the annual budget number. Here it's a revised number because sometimes things happen after the vote's been approved. The state then comes out with the pieces that the legislature determines in terms of what that yield number is, and maybe your CLA has been adjusted, and all of those pieces of information that you were working with in a sort of planning state early on now have been finalized. And so the budget gets revised a little bit after it's been approved. Okay. And you also see your YTD expenses. Again, that's year to date expenses. Can I compare those two from the expenses year to date through March and the revised budget? No, I can't really, because one's for 12 months and one's for 9 months. So this is an important one here. You're given your third quarter projection for the fiscal year total. So that includes any variances to date, plus any encumbrances, plus regular expenses as anticipated. And that's the number that your financial office is working with to compare to the annual budget. That's a lot. Is everybody okay with this?
I don't see any questions right now.
Okay, good. So the year to, and then of course you have the projected variance. And I kind of like to look at the variances because that tells me where the surprises are. And nobody likes surprises, especially in financial documents, right? And so as you look at this more closely, what you can see, for example, if the year-to-date instructional expense line is below budget, say there are fewer salaries because we didn't end up hiring everybody we thought we were going to, even though those positions were approved, the budgeted numbers are going to be lower, and that's going to follow through all the way to into the annual projections. But if it was a blip that and the instructional line, so maybe there was a moratorium on all supplies for a quarter because you were worried about your budget, and so it was low for third quarter, but it's going to, the classrooms are going to overcompensate in the fourth quarter to make up for that. So that's all taken into account in that projection number. And to somebody's question earlier, this, of course, is one page of many, but if you look at that total instruction line, you've got over $1 million favorable variance. That means you spent $1 million less than you, or you're going to spend $1 million less on that item than was budgeted. So that's something to take a look at. Why did we budget so high? What are the implications for that for our next budget cycle? Are we meeting the needs of our district? And I pick on that example just because it's at the top of the page, but it would be true throughout. And again, for those of you who are really not comfortable or accustomed to looking at financials, when you see a number like you do in guidance in the variance with the minuses, that means that the impact to the bottom line is going to be a negative. So you've overspent your guidance budget. Well, with everything that's gone on in the last year, that's, I guess, not really a big surprise. Kids have a lot of additional social emotional needs that we've been talking about at the state level. The governor and the Secretary of Education are mentioned regularly in their press conferences. And so it's no surprise that the guidance numbers might be high. And similarly with the health numbers, all of a sudden we needed extra health office staff to institute the COVID protocols. We didn't have enough people to do that who had the right qualifications. So, if you understand what's behind the numbers, then they're not so intimidating. So one of the important things where money is concerned is making sure that enough different people are looking at it. And that's why there's built into the law a separation of duties. So the school board approves the expenditures. That means somebody is looking at the warrant. Now that runs the gamut in how that's handled around the state. Some boards actually sit and review the warrant as a board at the meeting table, which personally I think is a poor use of board time. In other cases, when I was clerk of my board, I went into the bookkeeping office in the school and every 2 weeks, which is how frequently they paid the bills. And I just looked at the whole warrant and I looked at all the support and I was like, yeah, these match fine. And then the administration, again, delegated to whomever in the finance office, it prepares the warrants and the checks. So the boards approve the use of the money, the administration prepares the checks, and the treasurer of the school district releases the funds, or of the SU in most cases. So 3 different people or 3 different parties have had their eyes on these numbers before you're sending money out. And that's important because you all have some responsibility to make sure that it's all going right. And then there's the audit, which reviews all of the financial statements for the year, make sure that they're accurate, make sure that they have followed standard accounting practice, reviews your internal controls to make sure that your risk is being well managed and the depth of your audit. And then the board has a responsibility to understand that report. Understanding the scope of services provided by that audit and included in that audit, to read and discuss the auditor's letter at a minimum, which is the opinion and management discussion and analysis of what's going on in your district. And the board members, if you don't understand it, ask the auditor, or if you don't have access to the auditor, it may be your finance director who's coming to the board table to present the auditor's report. Ask that person. Somebody has answers to the questions of the things you don't understand because they are more familiar with the numbers and more familiar with the budget than you are. Again, though, remember to keep your queries at that really high level. And if you have a copy of the Essential Work of Vermont School Boards, the VSBA book with the spiral binding, there's actually sample questions to ask the auditor in that workbook. So what else? What were you hoping to hear today that we haven't gotten to?
I don't see anything in there right now.
I am always available for questions that occur to you this afternoon or tomorrow. This is the VSBA staff. I hope you know us all, at least remotely at this point, but we're all here for you and to help and support the work that you and your board are doing.